Hello, everyone. My name is Quincy, and I'll be the moderator today. With the increasing access and effectivity to micromobility and multimodal transportation options. And so, before we begin, I'm going to introduce everyone on the call. Like I said, my name is Quincy. I'm the co-founder of We All Rise. I'm a transportation planner originally from Portland, and I focus on the intersection of transportation, displacement, and poverty, and looking at how to support communities of color and underserved communities as they look to enhance their transportation systems. We also have Wafia Murray, and is a national recognized expert in the realm of transportation equity with a background in nonprofit leadership and youth development. She has presented at several national conferences and provided technical assistance to numerous bike shares and micromobility systems working to incorporate equity within their work. As the education program manager for the Bike Coalition of Greater Philadelphia, she coordinated its Life Route to School program, a national initiative promoting safety and physical activity in school-aged children through walking and biking. In her current role at the Better Bike Share Partnership program manager for the city of Philadelphia, Lafia works to address barriers to use of the bike share for individuals with low income and BIPOC communities, while increasing equitable access to micromobility systems worldwide. Thanks, Wafia, for being on the call. And then we also have Maurice. Maurice is the current senior director of U.S. government partnerships at Bird Ride Inc. He has worked both domestically and internationally in the public and private sectors, as well as in a number of political and advocacy campaigns. In October 2020, he was appointed by Governor Kate Brown to serve as a member of the Oregon Transportation Commission. In his prior purpose, in this prior public service, he worked in a diverse high-level roles in local and state government, as well as in the transit agent industry, ranging from Portland's Mayor Ted Wheeler, Chief of Staff, Deputy Director of Portland's Transportation Bureau, and CAO of District's Government Technology Office in Washington, D.C., to name a few. He has volunteered his time on a number of boards that are dedicated to social equity, sustainability, environmental justice through expansion of electric and human-powered mobility options, land use planning, including NSBSA, Green Roads Foundations, and Fourth Mobility. It's a pleasure to have both of you on the call today. So we're going to get started with one of our first questions. And I would love for you guys to take this anywhere that you want to. If there's any things that come up that you want to kind of understand with this, please feel free to take the question as long as you want. So the first question is, what are some major barriers to accessing micromobility sources in urban spaces?
I can start. I think some of the major barriers to access for shared micromobility, especially in a lot of the urban communities, is one around actual like access. Oftentimes, you see, shared micromobility devices. They're in the downtown area, center city area, campuses, more affluent areas, and then they may start to trickle down into some of the urban Black and Brown communities at either a later day or at a smaller size. So that's often a huge barrier. I mean, you can't access something if you literally don't have access to it in your neighborhood. Um, and along with oftentimes, affordability can be an issue. Even access in terms of, figuring out how to properly and safely navigate the system. So there's a couple of things that can be barriers to access of anything that you operate wide, which is why it's very important that before you implement any type of system, you should include those communities, specifically Black and Brown communities, within those conversations, so that you're able to figure out what some of those potential barriers may be, and come together and develop programs to help alleviate those barriers before they actually become an issue.
Yeah, picking up on Wafia's points, I think that the built environment in communities is part of the physical barrier. Then you have some of the social constructs that exist. I think we'll get into a little bit later in the discussion. Sort of the birth of the mobility justice movement is based around how BIPOC communities are how enforcement actions happen in those communities. I think Wafia was making the point about education and people just having a basic understanding that those mobility options like scooters or e-bikes or whatnot are actually available for them. We've obviously, as an industry and as a company, spent a great deal of time trying to address transit deserts, so areas of communities where there isn't robust transportation options, especially if you don't have access to a car. And you've got issues around safe infrastructure where people would actually feel secure and safe and actually riding these devices on city streets. That's a real question because we see, the levels of traffic violence that happen, across the country. So those are, some of the other barriers to just amplify the points that Wafia was making.
Well, Fia, I would love for you to speak kind of in your experience from the Safe Route to School planning and kind of looking at families. What are some barriers that families and maybe other ages face when trying to access e-scooters or bike systems?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's often I think it depends on sometimes the device. So for instance, biking, that's looked at as kind of 8 through 80. All ages, anyone can, hop on a bike, even if you're not necessarily old enough to rent a bike in your neighborhood, or if your bike share system has a limit. You could be able to rent a bike or have your own personal bike and do that as a family. And the same with scooters as well. I don't know about the e-scooters because those obviously have like an age limit, and there's other safety concerns that go along with those that pose barriers to being able to maybe do that as a family if you have younger children and things like that. So that is something that is worth thinking about, especially because the great thing about physical activity is being able to do it as a family, being able to do it as a unit. It's not just a form of like transportation and exercise. It's also a great way to come together as a community. And so being able to find ways to engage multiple age groups is really important. That's something from when I worked with the Safe Route to School program, even from my work with the bike share program locally in Philadelphia. Even though we do have an age limit for our bike share system, is 14 and up. We do still provide programming for youth because they aren't 14 today, but they won't be 8, 9, 10 forever. They'll eventually be old enough to use the bike share system. And what's important for us is that once they're able to use it, or even now as they're traveling, that they know how to do so safely. So we provide them with some education programming and things like that, so that we can do programming as a family.
Yeah, something that you both mentioned was the infrastructure concerns, and I'd love to hear, do you find that as being an issue where people don't have a destination to go to with the e-scooters or bikes? Or is it that there's not the infrastructure in place to even place or have the e-scooters and bikes make sense in those neighborhoods?
I don't know if that's to me or her first, but I would say that it's both and. I think that there are challenges, as I mentioned in my opening comments, around the built infrastructure and the way that cities and communities have been designed, many times systematically to separate communities from one another for various reasons. So the idea of being able to take a scooter or an e-bike or hover around or whatever it is to the desired location, there might be some structural barriers. I think one of the things that we've been working with cities on in our data sharing is really analyzing the pathways that people use. Quincy, you're from Portland, so you have a robust neighborhood greenway system, which I think is the envy of many communities around the country. Unfortunately, not every community has such a structure, and even that structures, I know, having worked for PBOT, has its limits to which communities it truly services. And so I know that one of the desires of DOTs around the country and other MPOs and whatnot is to expand greenway access or safe streets or slow streets. And we've seen that during the COVID pandemic. Communities themselves have taken up the charge of taking back the public right-of-way. In Washington, D.C., people have expanded the space that pedestrians and cyclists and e-scooter riders can leverage in an effort to have those greater freedoms to move around the community more safely. Seattle, the city council and the mayor reclaimed, I think it was 20 miles of residential streets. I know that there's been pushes by advocates in that community for expansion of those safe and slow streets. Same thing in Denver, Colorado, and other cities. So we know that there's a clamoring for a space for more multimodal options, particularly human scale options like biking and scooting. And so to the degree that the Bird and companies in the micromobility space can provide data and technology innovations that can help support expanding that access, that's what we're trying to do in a sustainable way.
Yeah, I would just add, I mean, definitely infrastructure plays a huge role in, people's ability, or, people feeling comfortable using any form of transportation, especially shared micromobility. If you want people to use it, they should be able to do so safely. And we know very well that, unfortunately, infrastructure projects are not all created equal, and oftentimes you'll see a lot of like new infrastructure, or current infrastructure is often prioritized in some of the more affluent areas, or some of the more downtown areas. And a lot of times a lot of the Black American communities are often not a part of that conversation in terms of infrastructure. Or you go walk around the neighborhood and there's not a bike lane, or anything to be found. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But that definitely is an issue of, like, how people prioritize specific projects, and also who you have as a part of the conversation for that project. Because a lot of times, planners planners come in, or advocates come in, and they want to implement bike lanes or infrastructure projects in certain communities, and they get pushback because it's like, why now? Why here? Are you putting in this infrastructure for us? Or is it, more so a form of gentrification of others trying to come in and take what's ours? So there's a lot of layers to that conversation, which is why it's important to really, have everyone at the table when you're making those decisions, and really start with building up that trust. But even beyond the physical infrastructure, in terms of street design, there's also, that other definition of safety, of not just the physical safety, but the personal safety of, do I physically feel, safe traveling in, this area, or traveling there. As we know, especially now with all of, the recent civil unrest that, has been happening. And we've seen, people literally be attacked in the right of way, be attacked, in bike lanes, or near bike lanes, or near bike infrastructure. So even if you have the infrastructure, are you helping people to be, personally feel safe when traveling with different modes and devices? So it's a very broad conversation that it takes on a lot of layers. And I think people need to have, an open mind when having these conversations around safety and infrastructure, and what that means for everyone.
Yeah, it's so important that you guys both brought up data and community engagement. We All Rise recently conducted a study with TriMet looking at public safety and security, and what we found was that physical and emotional and social safety are all different. People feel some way safer in other locations. They might feel socially safe in their neighborhood, but not physically safe. And so if you don't de-aggregate and understand the different levels of safety, you can't actually create a system that like supports everyone. On that kind of same grain, looking at data and community engagement, how can planners, advocates, and community developers present these barriers to city officials to better address inequalities related to accessing micromobility?
So I would say it kind of goes back again. I know I keep bringing this up, but it's so important to, make sure you have the right people at the table during the discussion, at every portion of the discussion, from the very beginning. So it's important to be able to let advocates know about, what some of these barriers are, but it's also important for these advocates to be able to, hear that from these community members, and to actually, talk with the communities, and talk with the residents that are having these issues, and not just when it comes time to implement a project, but these should be ongoing conversations. Who do you have on your planning team and on your infrastructure project team? Do you have people from the community on your team? Do you have those voices there? Do you have you have them on the payroll? Do you have that? So I think the best way to be able to the best way to be able to communicate this to advocates is for not just for advocates to get this information, but for how can advocates, help community members and put the power back into the community and have them really be, voices and really have real a true stake in, what projects and what things are being implemented in their neighborhood and in their right of way.
Yeah, that's such an important point. There's so many young people that don't have access to employment or to being able to participate into their community. And so they're trying to find ways to engage. And I think a lot of young people find that the only way to do that is to protest. And so, I really appreciate you bringing up that point and like ensuring that people are on payroll. I think the biggest reason that we created We All Rise is because we recognize that young people don't have an opportunity to get on payroll and actually be a part of the process. Love to hear what you have to say about this, Maurice.
I would echo a lot of those points. I think that one of the challenges and opportunities that we have with the advent of social media, and certainly now with COVID, so much more of the conversation is virtualized. And when we talk about infrastructure, we would be sort of deleterious in our duty if we didn't talk access to broadband, and the fact that there's so many people who just don't have the basics at home. And for many people, their cell phone is their only connection in many ways to the world. And that doesn't always come with a data plan. And so just identifying a lot of these barriers that we've sort of talked about earlier is part of this conversation as well. Being able to help to inform the community about opportunities for proper engagement. And we talk about bringing people to the table, and I absolutely agree with Wafia on that point. Part of the activity needs to be bringing the table to people, right? Finding people where they are, and being able to connect with them on that level too. And that takes a great deal of investment, and it's not easy. And community engagement is not something that is a 1 day or a 1 week or a 1 month sort of thing. It is a constant and consistent level of investment that needs to happen. And unfortunately, at the policy level, I can tell you that, whatever is not the squeaky wheel does not usually get the grease, right? And so when you're not hearing from individuals, a lot of that stuff gets forgotten about. And so you're just hearing from the loudest voices and the most direct engagers from the advocacy community and whatnot. And so there's lots of voices that get left behind in conversations, and it's incumbent upon policymakers and the private sector and academia and others to find new tools and new ways to engage the broadest range of people. And I go back to just the simple things like, do we have near ubiquitous Wi-Fi coverage or data coverage for folks to be able to engage? And one of the things we do as a company is we offer a SMS texting service, so that if you don't have a data plan, you can still leverage a scooter. We have cash payment options so that people can leverage devices. So that's one of many tools in the toolbox that would be needed to enhance these conversations and bring people to that table, or bring that table to them, as I was mentioning.
Yeah, something that I thought when I was in Birmingham, Alabama, I got to use an e-bike, and it had a card where I could use the card and load money at a station. And that was really helpful in terms of, not needing a phone, not needing a bank account, being able to use money and just load that onto the card. Maurice, I really enjoyed kind of the comments about bringing the table to the community instead of trying to get people to join the table. I think like often as advocates and as planners, we kind of call on the community to join in the discussion, and we don't think about the mental health aspects of that. There's a lot of historical pain regards to infrastructure inequality, and having community members to come to a table and talk about that pain is a really is a lot to ask. And so I think as we think as transportation planners, as professionals, we really need to think about how can we better access and get into the community and create those partnerships so that people feel like that they can actually voice their concerns in a way that is not redeveloping that historical inequalities. And so I guess in that same grain, how can cities create pilot programs to influence mode shifts to micromobility in an equitable way?
That's
Well,
a good
I
question.
mean, I think cities are. Oh, I'm sorry, Wafia. Go ahead. No, please
I was just
go
going
ahead.
to I was going to say, I think the best way to make pilot programs is to really think about what need is your program addressing, right? So that is really addressing a need that's in the community, and not something that you not a assumed need, but something that is really like, okay, this is something that we're hearing the community is struggling with, or that the community is interested in. So, let's work together to develop a pilot program. One example, so in Philadelphia, we have a program called Digital Skills and Bicycle Thrills. So the idea for that program came from, we were having conversations with community members. We were hearing that, digital access is really, and this was even post COVID, obviously, digital access was a huge concern for people. Either people didn't have, access to a lot of, resources, internet, other things like that, or they had access, but they, weren't comfortable navigating it. And with the way our bike share system is set up, there is a level of like digital access, of like going online and filling out your membership. And so we partnered with the City of Philadelphia's Office of Adult Education, whose initiative was also around providing internet access and connectivity to, Philadelphia residents. And so these are two city-run organizations that both are, working to meet a need. So we work together to, create the Digital Skills and Bicycle Thrills program, where participants come and it was a free 4-week course, and they will come and learn about digital access, so like how to set up an internet, how to maneuver social media, how to set up your bike share membership online, while also learning about bike safety education. We did rides, we did classes, and had a cool ceremony at the end. So it was a way to, bring these two worlds together. So some people would be a part of the program because they really wanted to um, sharpen up their digital access skills. Some people joined because they really wanted to learn more about the bike education. And so we were able to pull from both sectors. And at the end of it, everyone learned together, and everyone came out, even those that were like really not so much into the biking portion of it. By the end of it, they were like, okay, you know what, this biking thing is a lot easier than I thought. This is something that I can see how I can incorporate this into my everyday life. So I think it really starts with identifying the need, and then working with community members to see how can we implement this program to make it accessible for you, making sure that we host the cohorts at places throughout the neighborhood where the community goes to often, rec centers, libraries, community centers, making sure that we have a cohort at different parts throughout the city, each time, so that we're able to provide easier access to different people in different neighborhoods. So yeah, I would say that's an example, but really figuring out, making sure that your pilot is addressing a real need in the community and not an assumed need.
I love how in that pilot program you're like kind of looking upstream and realizing that there's a technology issue
Mm-hmm.
first, but it's also then making it harder for people to access biking.
Mm-hmm.
And so like looking at those two issues together, being able to solve kind of solve two issues at one program, and kind of join those two kind of communities of people that maybe think differently about them, and who is able to access the digital
Mm-hmm.
space, who's able to access biking, putting those together and saying, no, you can access the digital space in biking, is a really good way of re-socializing a community to think about these spaces a little bit differently. Maurice, do you have a comment?
Sure. No, I think that creating space and opportunity for gaining digital literacy is critical. I also, think that just having the vision and forethought to actually produce a pilot, we've seen an explosive expansion in the number of cities that are adding micromobility pilots to their portfolio for transportation options. I think we can't ignore the impact that COVID has had. I think we can look to Europe as being really the leader on taking this on, but I think we've seen cities like New York that are now going to put out an RFEI, that are looking to expand and test some theories and on transportation choice. To Wafia's point, I think it's really important that they identify the goals that they're trying to meet. Most cities, and Quincy, you're in Portland, have created both climate action plans, transportation transportation system plans, etc. A lot of those goals are very well defined and laid out in terms of congestion reduction, in terms of climate mitigation, in terms of economic opportunities, in terms of workforce and jobs. So there's lots of things that are out there that provide the true north for what these programs can look like. And I think just having the vision and willingness to sit down and structure a program. And I think one of the things that oftentimes is missing in this is that operators, and Bird being the pioneer in the e-scooter shared e-scooter space, we've been in over 150 cities operating. There's a lot of just learned institutional knowledge that we have around how these programs can best serve communities. And many times cities don't take advantage of some of the learned experience that operators have. And I think there's the opportunity for some really dynamic conversations. And we've seen really good partnerships spring out of pilots that have been created in our home base of Santa Monica. We've grown a great deal since September of 2017. You now see in terms of the right of way, car parking spaces being reclaimed for bike and scooter parking. We see that the bike lanes are being utilized in a new and exciting way because of COVID. The reclaiming of right-of-way space, for restaurants in terms of being able to serve patrons means that there's less parking for cars, which means that the need for things like micromobility devices has increased. So all of these things, talking about some of the upstream issues, have certainly had very tangible impacts on communities. And I think just putting pilots in place to test out a few things, and that's essentially what a pilot is for, right? Is to test some things, see what works and doesn't work. And I think leveraging some of the experience from providers and academicians and others is really important in that process,
Yeah,
as well as with the community.
yeah, definitely. That makes total sense. And, kind of speaking, because Maurice, you were speaking about Portland, I can kind of share a couple of pilots that are going on in Portland right now that I think have done that kind of same kind of idea. One of them is our transportation wallet, which allows for low-income residents to get credits for different transportation uses, including the streetcar, bike town, e-scooter systems. And so they actually have money to use for these different systems and attempting to try to create a multimodal system. Another thing that's coming out very soon is TriMet's doing a trip planner, which includes Lyft and includes the Hopper shared mobility kind of uses. And so it actually allows you to plan your trip, including multimodal spaces. And then, one thing that We All Rise was able to do is we're looking very, very upstream and realizing that a lot of the reason why people of color and underserved community members don't use e-scooters is they don't live in downtown anymore. They don't live in these spaces where they actually would be able to use it. So we're creating a multicultural reentry program focusing on commercial real estate. So trying to reenter businesses of color so that then patrons want to go to those spaces and feel like they have a space in downtown. And then maybe we'll pick up an e-scooter to get around to a different location. So really, I think it's an understanding where the issue is and creating a program that evaluates that issue and allows for people to see a different way when it comes to transportation. And then, so the next question that we have, do you see micromobility modes as a reliable form of transportation? And how does the influence of choice when deciding between a micromobility unit and another form of transportation, how has that changed in communities of color? So how does choice dictate deciding between a micromobility unit and a non-micromobility unit, like an SOV?
Mm-hmm. So I think the question of how reliable shared micromobility is for people, I think it depends on how you define reliability. So reliable in terms of making for instance, during the recent pandemic and even the recent recent activities, we've seen a lot of companies leave the market completely. We've seen a lot of companies, pull back, pull back equipment, pull back resources during a time when literally people needed access to travel more than ever, be for several reasons. And so in terms of reliability, if you do begin to rely on this as your mode of transportation, or really when it's a time when you really need it the most and it's not there, then it's not reliable. So I think that's a big thing to think about in terms of some of the other barriers that we mentioned previously, of like, and as you were talking about, just accessibility of, is this device in your neighborhood, can you guarantee that it's going to be there often? Because rebalancing is a huge part of dockless modes, or just modes in general, of like, there may be a scooter or a bike in your neighborhood, but then say someone takes it downtown, are they making sure that that device is put back in your neighborhood in a timely manner during the proper time, so that you can have access to it again? So there's a lot of questions around reliability. So I think, for some, yes, maybe, but for many, it's not seen as reliable. I think it just depends on the company. And then the second part of your question, can you remind me what the second part was? I think it was about
Yeah, it was related to choice.
yeah,
Yeah, how much is choice and being able to choose
yeah.
like actually affect?
Yeah, so I think a lot of that, well, it depends on some of the things we just mentioned of reliability and accessibility. But I think it also just depends on your lifestyle. Thinking, is it feasible for someone to use, a scooter or a bike if they're traveling? Maybe they have kids that they have to travel with, and they can't, load all their kids on. You can't load, more than yourself on the scooter. And it's, unless you have like cargo bike or something, an attachment on a bike, is difficult to travel with kids, or even if you have a job that requires you to, carry a lot of things to travel. So I think it depends on your lifestyle in terms of what mode you choose. It also depends on, affordability, access. So some of the things we've already mentioned, but I think really it comes down to like lifestyle, and it comes down to, what you have planned for that day. I think it's also important to think about when we talk about shared micromobility and we talk about how we use it. It's not always feasible, or it's not always about just using it for regular transportation to get from point A, regular transportation as an everyday mode. Sometimes it could just be used as, recreation, or just, a way to get outside and get some fresh air. So, while it may not be suitable for me to use a bike or a scooter to get back and forth to work, or to get back and forth to, for my everyday errands, maybe, on an off day, I just want to, take a bike ride or take a scooter ride and just, get some fresh air, just get some physical activity, just kind of, get some relief. And I think it's important to understand that there's that aspect of shared micromobility as well, and still continue to market and promote and provide accessible resources for that audience as well.
I'll just briefly say I agree with Wafia that the lifestyle choices and some of the other needs, whether it's being able to transport family, all weigh into the choices that you make. I think when we're thinking about this, at a local level, at a state level, at federal level, we don't. Each of these communities doesn't start at the same place. So, for example, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania hasn't legalized scooters for street use, so there aren't e-scooters available, shared e-scooters available in Pennsylvania. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts, there's been a lot of discussion around state law, and how micromobility in the form of e-scooters would be deployed. So, there's still communities out there that it's just restricted at this point. For those that have a broader set of mobility choices, which is inclusive of e-scooters, we've seen, I think, really interesting stats. Prior to COVID, we were seeing about a third of all scooter trips were being, to and from transit. So, which implies that there's some measure of folks taking it for more than just leisure trips, and are using it as part of their commute. in Santa Monica, and it was a stat that we've seen across the board in a number of our surveys in cities. Close to 80% of folks are using scooters for their daily commute trips, and so we're seeing a replacement of car trips. We're seeing an avoidance of CO2. I think our company alone has helped to alleviate about 75 million tons of CO2 emissions from the atmosphere. So there's lots of benefits that we see from having scooter programs in cities. Obviously we recognize that legal processes and creating new laws and programs is not a flip of the switch, that it does take some time. But part of the challenge that we face in being able to provide these services to the broadest number of people are just some of the regulatory structures that are in place. But assuming that those structures allow for these micromobility options, I think we've seen, and NACTO has put out in the last 2 years their studies around micromobility. So dockless and docked bikes, e-bikes, e-scooters, and the explosive growth of both. I think in 2018 it was around 80 plus million rides, with about 2/3 or more of those being e-scooters. In 2019 it was I think a doubling of that number, and again about 2/3 or more, might have been closer to 3/4, was e-scooter rides. So I think there's clearly a desire for this micromobility choice for human scale transportation. I would be remiss if I didn't really acknowledge the work that so many pedestrian and bicycle advocacy organizations have done over the years to get us to this point, and now we're in a position where we can collectively come together and bring our voices together to advocate with data, with the outcomes that communities have identified and defined in their sort of core documents and their comprehensive plans and whatnot. And we have a tool that can be added to the toolkit to help meet many of those goals. And in terms of reliability, I think for us, we've seen in several cities that they have identified micromobility as an essential service, whereas others have not. And so again, it's a matter of perspective. We see ourselves as an essential transportation service, as an augmentation to the existing transit systems, and that's something that hopefully, as we move into 2021 and hopefully get a handle on this pandemic, we'll see additional growth and opportunities to support more communities across the country.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. I kind of want to take what you guys kind of had said in those last statements and kind of capture it and see what your opinions are on kind of these statements. So something that was kind of brought together was recreation, lifestyle, and public space seem to be like the important aspects to have like a really good infrastructure so that people use e-scooters and have the ability to bike and have those opportunities. When I think